I am Kim, 32 years old, and after 7 years at Innovatech Solutions, I thought I understood office politics. That was until last month when our Vice President Richard looked me in the eyes at the airport gate and said, "Sorry, no seat for you for the Hawaii client trip I had spent weeks planning." What he did not know was that I had carefully crafted an MSA clause that would become my secret weapon. The look on his face when the client CEO personally requested me was worth every sleepless night I had spent on that contract. Before I dive into how I turned this attempted sabotage into my greatest professional triumph, let me know where you are watching from and hit that like and subscribe button if you have ever had someone try to take credit for your hard work. My journey at Innovatech Solutions began 7 years ago. I started as an administrative assistant, the person who organized meetings, ordered lunch, and made sure everyone had what they needed. I was good at my job, but I wanted more. During those early years, I observed how contracts shaped our business relationships. Every night after work, I would study contract law, taking online courses and reading everything I could find about master service agreements. After 2 years, I earned a promotion to contract coordinator. 3 years after that, I became a full contract specialist. Not the most glamorous title, but in a tech consulting firm that lives and dies by its client agreements, it was a position of significant influence. My attention to detail became legendary within the company. Colleagues joked that I could spot a problematic clause from a mile away. "Kim is the reason we have never been sued," our CEO would say at company meetings. I took pride in that reputation, even if it meant I was often working late, reviewing agreements line by line when others had gone home. The Hawaii client was special. Sunshine Resorts, a luxury hotel chain with 23 properties across the Hawaiian Islands, was looking to completely overhaul their technology systems. From reservation software to customer relationship management, they needed a complete digital transformation. The potential contract was worth millions. I had been involved from day one. While our sales team made flashy presentations about innovation and digital futures, I was the one who spent countless hours understanding Sunshine Resort's specific needs. I learned their operational pain points, studied their existing vendor relationships, and identified potential legal pitfalls. Richard Parker, our Vice President of Client Relations, was the kind of executive who looked good in company photos. Tall, always impeccably dressed with a winning smile he deployed strategically. Clients loved him. Staff feared him. Richard had a talent for showing up at the final stages of a project, making a few suggestions, and somehow receiving credit for the entire thing. Richard closed another big one, people would say, ignoring the team that had worked for months to get the deal to the finishing line. I had experienced Richard's credit stealing firsthand on 3 previous deals, but the Sunshine Resorts contract was different. This one was partially my creation from the ground up. I had been the one to initially identify their needs during a preliminary market research project. I had suggested we approach them with a customized proposal rather than our standard package. For weeks, I prepared for the Hawaii trip where we would finalize the deal. I created detailed briefing documents on each executive we would meet. I developed contingency plans for potential contract objections. I even learned about Hawaiian business customs to ensure we would make a good impression. Most importantly, I had included a special clause in our master service agreement. Section 12.4 specifically named me as the designated contract specialist whose presence was required at all major client meetings. It was a clause I had begun inserting into our most important contracts after witnessing how easily team members could be sidelined. Most executives never read that far into the agreement. Marcus Kalani, the CEO of Sunshine Resorts, had not only read it but had commented positively on the commitment to continuity it represented. "I appreciate knowing the same person who drafted this agreement will be present for implementation," Marcus had said during our video call. As the trip approached, I began to notice concerning signs. Richard started excluding me from planning emails. Meeting invites would appear on my calendar only to disappear hours later. When I asked about travel arrangements, I received vague responses. "We are still finalizing the details," his assistant would say. I was not without allies. Samantha from legal had witnessed Richard taking credit for my work before. David from project implementation valued my detailed contract notes that made his job easier. Neither had Richard's influence, but they offered support in small ways. Document everything Samantha advised over coffee. That is the only protection against people like Richard. I had taken her advice to heart-saving emails, documenting conversations, and keeping meticulous records of my contributions to the Sunshine Resorts deal. The trip was scheduled for 3 days. Day 1 would be relationship building. Days 2 and 3 would focus on finalizing contract details and implementation timelines. I had prepared separate folders for each day, color-coded and organized with military precision. The evening before our flight, I received an email confirmation of my seat assignment. I packed my suitcase with professional attire, appropriate for both business meetings and the tropical climate. I included copies of all relevant documents despite everything being available digitally. Experience had taught me to always have backups. That night I barely slept, not from worry, but from excitement. This contract would be a milestone in my career. I had no idea that Richard had already set his plan in motion to ensure I would never board that plane. My alarm went off at 4:30 in the morning. Our flight to Honolulu was scheduled for 7:15 and I wanted to arrive early. I double-checked my suitcase, making sure I had packed my medication chargers and an extra pair of professional shoes. The forecast showed afternoon showers in Honolulu, so I added a compact umbrella to my carry-on. I arrived at Seattle-Tacoma International Airport 2 hours before departure. The terminal was already buzzing with early morning travelers. I spotted several of my colleagues near the check-in counter, their blue Innovatech luggage tags visible from a distance. Richard was there speaking animatedly to a young man I recognized as Brad Thompson, an analyst who had joined the company only 4 months ago. Brad looked overwhelmed but excited, clutching a leather portfolio that still had the sheen of newness. I approached the group, rolling my carefully packed suitcase behind me. "Good morning, everyone," I said, maintaining a professional smile despite the early hour. Several colleagues returned my greeting, but Richard merely glanced in my direction before returning to his conversation with Brad. I stood there awkwardly for a moment before Richard finally acknowledged my presence. "Kim," he said, his voice carrying a note of feigned surprise. "What are you doing here so early?" "Same as everyone else," I replied, "getting ready to board our flight to Honolulu." Richard exchanged glances with his assistant Janet, who suddenly became very interested in the boarding passes she was distributing to the team. I noticed she was giving one to Brad. "About that," Richard said, stepping closer and lowering his voice as if sharing a regrettable secret. "There have been some last-minute changes to the team composition." My stomach tightened. "What kind of changes?" "Brad will be handling the contract details for this trip," Richard said, placing his hand on the young analyst's shoulder. Brad at least had the decency to look uncomfortable. "But I prepared all the documentation," I said. "I know the contract inside and out. I have been working with Marcus and his team for months." Richard's expression was a practiced mix of regret and firmness. "We need to give our junior staff opportunities to grow. Brad has a background in hospitality from his previous job." "He worked at a coffee shop in college," I said, unable to keep the edge from my voice. Several colleagues pretended not to listen, but I could see them stealing glances. Richard's smile tightened. "The decision has been made, Kim. We need you back at the office to handle other contracts." I took a deep breath, trying to maintain my composure. "My seat has already been booked. The client is expecting me to be there." "Plans change," Richard said with a dismissive wave. "Sorry, no seat for you. Budget cuts mean we had to trim the team." He turned away, effectively ending the conversation. I stood frozen as the reality of the situation sank in. Budget cuts, the seats were already paid for. This had nothing to do with budgets, and everything to do with Richard wanting to control the narrative with the client. "But Section 12.4 of the MSA specifically requires my presence," I said loud enough for others to hear. Richard turned back, irritation flashing across his face. "No client reads those details, Kim." They just want results, not specific personnel. He glanced at his watch. We should head to security. I looked around at my colleagues, hoping for support. Most avoided eye contact, uncomfortable with the confrontation. David gave me a sympathetic look but said nothing. Only Samantha stepped forward. Richard Kim has been instrumental in getting this deal to where it is, she said. Her knowledge of the contract terms is unparalleled. Richard's expression hardened. I appreciate your input, Samantha, but, as I said, the decision has been made. Kim can hold down the fort while we are gone. Hold down the fort, like I was an administrative assistant again, rather than the contract specialist who had crafted the very agreement they were flying to Hawaii to finalize. You cannot just replace me at the last minute, I said, my voice quavering slightly, despite my efforts to remain professional. This is my project too. Your project? Richard laughed, drawing attention from nearby travelers. This is an Innovatech project, and I decide who represents us with the client. He checked his watch again. We need to get through security. Janet will help you arrange a rideshare back home. I watched in disbelief as Richard led the team toward the security checkpoint. Brad glanced back at me, a mix of guilt and excitement on his face. He was getting a free trip to Hawaii and a chance to impress the VP, all at my expense. Janet approached me, her expression carefully neutral. I can call you a car, she offered. I drove myself, I replied coldly. I really am sorry about this, she said, lowering her voice. It was a last-minute decision. Richard only told me yesterday afternoon, which meant he had planned this waiting until the last possible moment to prevent me from appealing to higher management. When did Brad find out he was going? I asked. Janet hesitated. 3 days ago. Richard had me book his flight then. 3 days. While I had been preparing documents and reviewing contract details, Richard had already decided to replace me. The betrayal stung even more, knowing it had been premeditated. I watched as my colleagues proceeded through security, Richard at the front of the group like a triumphant general leading his troops. I had spent weeks preparing for this trip. I had spoken directly with Marcus Kalani multiple times. I knew what mattered to him and his team. Brad, for all his enthusiasm, would be flying blind. As the last of my colleagues disappeared through the security checkpoint, I remained standing in the terminal, my suitcase beside me, the ambient noise of the airport fading as I processed what had just happened. Richard had not only stolen my seat, but had attempted to steal my professional dignity. The worst part was knowing that the client would suffer. Brad was smart but inexperienced. He did not know the nuances of the agreement, the specific concerns Marcus had raised during our preliminary discussions, or the custom terms I had negotiated to address Sunshine Resort's unique needs. I had 2 choices: accept defeat and go home, or find another way to fulfill my professional responsibility to the client. As I stood in that terminal, watching the Hawaii-bound plane begin boarding without me, I decided that Richard Parker had underestimated me for the last time. I found a quiet corner of the airport cafe and sank into a chair, my suitcase parked beside me. The initial shock was wearing off, replaced by a cold clarity. My hands trembled slightly as I ordered a black coffee, more from anger than distress. As I waited for my coffee, I replayed the crafting of the MSA in my mind. 3 months ago, I had been reviewing our standard agreement template, looking for ways to strengthen our position while maintaining client satisfaction. I had added Section 12.4 after witnessing another contract specialist get sidelined on a major deal. The clause was straightforward: Kim Anderson, in her capacity as contract specialist, shall be present at all material meetings between Innovatech Solutions and Sunshine Resorts for the duration of this agreement to ensure continuity of understanding and implementation of contractual terms. I had included similar language in previous contracts, but this was the first time I had specifically named myself rather than just my role. Marcus had not only approved the clause, but had specifically mentioned appreciating the commitment to consistency. The barista called my name, interrupting my thoughts. I retrieved my coffee and returned to my corner table. I pulled out my phone, opened my email, and located the final signed version of the MSA. I scrolled to section 12.4, confirming the exact wording. It was there, clear and unambiguous, with both our CEO's and Marcus's electronic signatures at the bottom of the document. I had a decision to make. I could email our CEO explaining how Richard had violated a contractual obligation. But our CEO was traveling in Europe, 12 time zones away, and likely would not see my message until tomorrow at the earliest. By then, Richard would have established himself with the client. I could call our chief legal officer, but without the CEO's backing, they might hesitate to challenge a VP. Corporate hierarchies were real, and Richard had friends in high places. Then, I remembered my direct communications with Marcus. Unlike many CEOs who delegated contract reviews, Marcus was hands-on, personally invested in his company's digital transformation. We had exchanged several emails discussing specific terms. He had even called me directly twice to clarify points. I finished my coffee and made my decision. I opened my text messages and composed a careful note to Marcus. Good morning, Marcus. This is Kim Anderson from Innovatic. I regret to inform you that I have been removed from the Sunshine Resorts project at the last minute, despite Section 12.4 of our agreement. I believed you should be aware of this change given our previous discussions about continuity. I wish your team and Innovatech a productive meeting. I read it 3 times, ensuring it was professional and factual, not emotional. Then I hit send. I did not expect an immediate response. Marcus was a busy executive who likely received hundreds of messages daily. I was prepared to wait, perhaps book a flight home, and follow up later. To my surprise, my phone rang less than 2 minutes later. Marcus's name appeared on the screen. Marcus, I answered, trying to keep my voice steady. Thank you for calling. Kim, his deep voice came through clearly. I just received your message. What is this about you being removed from the project? I explained what had happened, sticking to the facts without casting aspersions on Richard. Marcus listened without interruption. When I finished, he was silent for a moment. Then, this is unacceptable. Section 12.4 was important to me. I want continuity with the people who understand our needs. I understand if you need to proceed with the meetings as scheduled, I said, not wanting to disrupt their business. No, Marcus said firmly. The MSA is clear. My legal team was very specific about wanting you involved throughout the implementation process. I appreciate that, but I am still at the Seattle airport. Your meetings begin tomorrow morning. There is another flight to Honolulu in 3 hours, Marcus said. I will have my assistant book you a seat and email you the details. We will delay substantive discussions until you arrive. I was speechless for a moment. That is incredibly generous, Marcus. It is not generosity, it is good business, he replied. I want this digital transformation to succeed, and that means having the right people in the room. Your attention to detail in the contract phase impressed me. That is the kind of thoroughness we need. After we disconnected, I sat back processing what had just happened. A direct intervention from the client's CEO was beyond anything I had anticipated. Within 10 minutes, I received an email confirmation for a first-class seat on the 12:30 flight to Honolulu. I had 3 hours to wait. I used the time productively reviewing my notes and preparation materials. I also forwarded the flight confirmation to our company travel department with a brief professional note explaining that the client had requested my presence per Section 12.4 of the MSA. As boarding time approached, I felt a complex mix of emotions. Vindication, certainly, but also apprehension about the confrontation that would inevitably occur when I arrived in Hawaii. Richard would not take this development well. I boarded the plane and settled into my first-class seat, a luxury I rarely experienced on company trips. As the aircraft took off, carrying me over the Pacific toward Hawaii, I reviewed my strategy. I would remain professional at all times. I would focus on the client's needs rather than the internal politics. I would not seek confrontation with Richard, but would not back down from my contractual responsibilities. The flight attendant offered me a beverage. I chose sparkling water, wanting to keep my mind clear for what was to come. Looking out the window at the vast Pacific Ocean below, I felt a sense of calm determination replace my earlier anger. This was no longer about Richard's power play or my wounded pride. It was about professional integrity and fulfilling our obligations to a client who had specifically requested my expertise. 6 hours later, as the plane began its descent into Honolulu International Airport, I prepared myself for the next phase of this unexpected chess match. Richard had made his move thinking he had removed me from the board entirely. What he did not realize was that in chess, sometimes a pawn can reach the other side of the board and transform into something much more powerful. The Hawaiian air hit me like a warm, fragrant embrace as I exited the terminal. Despite the circumstances, I could not help but appreciate the beauty around me. Royal palms swayed against a perfect blue sky, and even the airport landscaping featured vibrant tropical flowers. My professional mindset quickly returned as I spotted the driver Marcus had sent, holding a sign with my name. The drive to the Sunshine Resort's flagship property took 30 minutes, winding along coastline views that would have been breathtaking under different circumstances. I used the time to center myself and review key points of the contract once more. The Sunshine Grand Honolulu was an impressive property, its soaring lobby open to the elements on one side, offering views of a pristine private beach. Under normal circumstances, I would have paused to admire the architecture, the cascading water feature, the subtle integration of traditional Hawaiian design elements with modern luxury. Instead, my eyes scanned the spacious lobby for familiar faces. It was just past 4 in the afternoon, and I knew from the itinerary that the Innovatic team would have completed their initial welcome meeting and property tour. I spotted them gathered near the bar area adjacent to the lobby. Richard stood at the center of the group, gesturing expansively, as he spoke to a man I recognized from video calls as William Chen, Sunshine's Chief Technology Officer. Brad hovered nearby, looking slightly overwhelmed, but trying to appear engaged. Samantha was the first to notice me approaching. Her eyes widened, and she subtly nudged David, who turned and failed to suppress a smile. One by one, my colleagues became aware of my presence, conversations faltering as surprise registered on their faces. Richard was mid-sentence when he finally spotted me. He froze momentarily, his practiced smile slipping before he quickly recovered. "Kim," he said, his voice carrying a warning edge, despite his attempt to sound pleasant. "What an unexpected surprise." Before I could respond, Brad blurted out, "Did the company send you after all?" "Not exactly," I said, maintaining a professional demeanor. "The client requested my presence per Section 12.4 of our MSA." Richard's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "We were managing just fine," he said, stepping toward me and lowering his voice. "This is highly irregular." "What is irregular is changing the designated contract specialist without client approval," I replied, matching his quiet tone while maintaining eye contact. Richard glanced around, clearly concerned about making a scene in front of the client representatives. "We should discuss this privately." "I would be happy to, after I greet our clients," I said, stepping around him toward William Chen. Richard reached for my arm but stopped himself, aware of the watching eyes. "This is not over," he muttered. I greeted William warmly, having spoken with him several times during contract negotiations. He seemed genuinely pleased to see me, immediately launching into questions about specific implementation details that I was able to answer comprehensively. I was mid-conversation with William when a tall, distinguished man with silver-streaked black hair entered the lobby from a side corridor. Marcus Kalani carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who had built a hospitality empire from the ground up. He surveyed the room briefly before his eyes landed on me. "Kim Anderson," he called, striding purposefully across the lobby. "You made it." The entire Innovatech team turned to watch as Marcus approached, completely bypassing Richard to shake my hand warmly. "Thank you for accommodating my late arrival, Marcus," I said. "Nonsense," Marcus replied loudly enough for everyone to hear. "Your presence is not an accommodation. It is a contractual requirement that I personally insisted upon." He glanced briefly at Richard before continuing. "Section 12.4 is quite clear on that point." Richard stepped forward, attempting to redirect attention. Marcus, we were just discussing the implementation timeline for the reservation system integration. Marcus acknowledged Richard with a brief nod but kept his focus on me. Kim, I would like you to join me for dinner this evening. I have some specific questions about the contract terms related to the data migration schedule. I would be happy to, I replied, acutely aware of Richard's barely contained frustration. Excellent, Marcus said. 7 p.m. in the executive dining room. He turned to Richard. You are welcome to join us, of course. I would not miss it, Richard said, his smile not reaching his eyes. Marcus excused himself to attend another meeting, leaving me with the Innovatic team and several Sunshine executives. An awkward silence followed his departure. Richard quickly attempted to reassert control. Let us continue our discussion about the timeline. Brad has prepared some preliminary schedules. Brad fumbled with his tablet, pulling up a generic implementation timeline that lacked the customizations I had prepared. When William asked about the special provisions for their legacy reservation data, Brad looked blankly at Richard. Kim has been working on those details, Samantha interjected smoothly. Perhaps she can address William's question. I explained the customized migration approach we had developed specifically for Sunshine's complex data structures, watching as William nodded with growing approval. Richard interrupted several times, trying to steer the conversation back to generalities where Brad could contribute. Each time, the Sunshine executives politely acknowledged him before directing follow-up questions to me. As the afternoon meeting concluded, Richard pulled me aside, his expression thunderous despite his forced smile. My office would like a word with you, he said, guiding me toward a quiet corner of the lobby. Once we were out of earshot, his facade dropped. What do you think you are doing? He demanded. You have undermined my authority and embarrassed the company. I have done my job, I replied calmly. The job I was contracted to do by both Innovatic and Sunshine Resorts. You went around proper channels. You should have come to me if you had concerns. I did. At the airport, you dismissed me and my contractual obligations. Richard's face flushed. This little power play might feel good now, but trust me, it will not end well for your career. I have influence with the executive team that you cannot imagine. Are you threatening me? I asked, maintaining a neutral tone. I am giving you professional advice, Richard said. Go back to Seattle tomorrow. Tell Marcus you were needed on another project. I will smooth things over. I met his gaze steadily. I will not be returning to Seattle until our contractual obligations here are fulfilled. Marcus specifically requested my presence, and our company policy is to prioritize client requests. This is not about company policy, Richard hissed. This is about respecting the chain of command. And this is not about hierarchy, I countered. This is about fulfilling our contractual obligations and providing the client with the expertise they specifically requested. Our tense conversation was interrupted by David approaching. Excuse me, he said, looking uncomfortable. The client team is asking for Kim to review some technical requirements before dinner. Richard stared at me for a long moment before stepping back. This conversation is not finished, he said quietly before walking away. As I followed David toward the meeting room, he whispered, That was intense. Are you okay? I am fine, I replied, straightening my jacket, but I have a feeling tomorrow is going to be even more challenging. David nodded. The team is with you, you know. We all saw what happened. It was wrong. His support warmed me, but I knew that Richard would not give up easily. He had too much pride invested in controlling this client relationship. Tomorrow would indeed be the real test, and I needed to be prepared for whatever move Richard might make next. The executive dining room of the Sunshine Grand Honolulu offered breathtaking sunset views over the Pacific. Under different circumstances, I would have been captivated by the golden light playing across the water and the elegant five-star setting. Instead, my mind was focused on the business dinner ahead and the inevitable tension with Richard. I arrived 10 minutes early, preferring to be the first one there. The maitre escorted me to a private dining area separated from the main restaurant by intricately carved wooden screens depicting Hawaiian mythology. Marcus arrived precisely at 7, followed moments later by Richard, who had clearly timed his entrance to avoid being either early or late. Brad trailed behind him, looking uncomfortable in a suit that seemed slightly too large for his frame. "I hope you do not mind that I brought Brad along," Richard said smoothly. "As our newest team member, he benefits greatly from these client interactions." It was a calculated move. Richard was positioning Brad as a sympathetic figure, the young professional eager to learn, making any objection from me seem petty. "Of course not," I replied with a genuine smile toward Brad. "Different perspectives are always valuable." Marcus gestured for us to sit. "I have taken the liberty of ordering a selection of local specialties for us to share," he said. "The chef here does remarkable things with fresh island fish." The first course arrived, a delicate preparation of raw ahi tuna with avocado and local citrus. As we began to eat, Marcus turned the conversation directly to business. "Kim, I have been reviewing the data security provisions in the MSA," he said. "I am particularly interested in the liability limitations regarding third-party vendors." It was a complex topic that I had anticipated. "Section 8.3 addresses this specifically," I replied without needing to consult any notes. "We have structured a shared responsibility model that limits Innovatic's liability for vendor breaches while still providing you with recourse for negligence in our vendor selection or oversight." Marcus nodded appreciatively. "And the incident response timeline requirements: 4 hours for critical systems, 8 for secondary systems, and 24 for non-customer-facing applications," I said, "with financial penalties accruing for any delays beyond those windows." Throughout this exchange, Richard repeatedly tried to redirect the conversation to broader themes. "The important thing to remember, Marcus, is that Innovatech stands behind our work 100%. The specific details can always be adjusted to meet your needs." Marcus was not deterred. "In my experience, Mr. Parker, the specific details are what separate a good contract from a great one." He turned back to me. "The implementation milestone schedule has some aggressive targets. How confident are you in those dates?" Before I could answer, Brad jumped in clearly, having been coached by Richard. "Our implementation team has an excellent track record of on-time deliveries," he said, repeating a line from our marketing materials. William Chen, who had joined us for the main course, raised an eyebrow. "That does not quite answer the question," he observed. I stepped in. "The schedule is ambitious but achievable with 2 caveats," I said. "First, we will need early access to your legacy systems for complete data mapping. Second, the user acceptance testing phase may need to be extended for your highest volume properties." William nodded. "That aligns with my assessment as well." Richard attempted to reassert control. "Our project management team has developed a comprehensive approach to these implementations," he said, launching into a description of our standard methodology that failed to address Sunshine's specific situation. As the dinner progressed, a pattern emerged. Marcus or William would ask specific, detailed questions. I would provide precise answers grounded in both the contract terms and my knowledge of Sunshine's unique needs. Richard would attempt to generalize the discussion back to Innovatech's capabilities, while Brad struggled to contribute anything substantial. During dessert, a traditional Hawaiian coconut pudding, Richard made his most aggressive move yet. "Marcus I wanted to discuss a modification to our team structure," he said. "Given the scope of this project, I am thinking we should assign a different contract specialist to work with Brad. Kim has other significant clients demanding her attention back in Seattle." The table fell silent. Marcus set down his spoon and looked directly at Richard. "That would constitute a material change to our agreement." "Merely an adjustment to better serve your needs," Richard countered smoothly. "Our needs," Marcus said firmly, "are clearly stated in Section 12.4 of the MSA, which specifically names Kim as the contract specialist assigned to this project." Richard maintained his smile, but I could see tension in his jaw. Contracts are living documents meant to evolve as circumstances change. "Indeed, they are," Marcus agreed. Through the formal amendment process outlined in Section 15, which requires written agreement from both parties, he turned to me. Kim would Innovatech typically recommend that a client waive a contractual requirement that was specifically negotiated. No, I said simply, especially not one that was highlighted as important during the negotiation process. Richard's smile became strained. I think we are making too much of a simple staffing adjustment. Perhaps, Marcus replied, but in my experience, how a company handles its explicit commitments in the beginning of a relationship sets the tone for everything that follows. The message was clear. Richard's attempted power play had backfired spectacularly. After dinner, as we walked back toward the lobby, Richard gripped my arm, pulling me slightly behind the group. You have made a serious mistake, he said quietly. This little victory will be short-lived. I removed his hand from my arm. This is not about winning or losing, Richard. It is about doing the job I was contracted to do. We will see how tomorrow goes, he said ominously before walking away. When I returned to my hotel room, I found a message from Samantha Team Breakfast, 7 a.m. hotel restaurant. Strength in numbers. As I prepared for bed, I considered the chessboard as it now stood. Richard had attempted to remove me entirely, then tried to replace me when that failed. Both moves had been blocked. Tomorrow would be the final day of meetings, where the implementation plan would be finalized and approved. Richard would be desperate to reassert control. I needed to be ready for whatever he might try next while keeping my focus where it belonged, on ensuring the success of the project and fulfilling our obligations to the client. I met Samantha, David, and 2 other team members for breakfast at 7. The mood was cautiously optimistic. Word has spread about what happened yesterday, David said quietly. Several executives from Sunshine made a point of telling me how impressed they were with your knowledge of their needs. Richard has been making calls back to headquarters all morning, Samantha added. He arrived at the restaurant earlier, saw us together, and immediately left while talking intensely on his phone. I appreciated their support, but remained focused on the day ahead. Today is about finalizing the implementation plan and getting formal approval to proceed, I reminded them. We need to stay professional and centered on delivering for the client. The main meeting was scheduled for 9 a.m. in the resort's largest conference room. I arrived 15 minutes early to set up my materials and center myself. The room gradually filled with Sunshine executives and my Innovatech colleagues. Richard arrived last precisely at 9, with Brad following close behind. He appeared composed, but the tightness around his eyes suggested a sleepless night. Marcus called the meeting to order. Today we finalize our digital transformation journey together, he began. Before we dive into the implementation details, I want to address something important. My heart rate accelerated slightly. Had Richard somehow convinced Marcus to change his position overnight? Partnerships are built on trust, Marcus continued. Yesterday highlighted for me why Innovatech has earned our business. When faced with a challenge regarding our agreement, your company honored its commitments rather than seeking the easy path. Richard shifted uncomfortably in his seat, but maintained his professional demeanor. Now Marcus said, let us turn to the implementation schedule. Kim, would you walk us through the major milestones? I stood and presented the customized implementation roadmap I had prepared, addressing specific questions from Sunshine's technical and operations teams. Throughout my presentation, Richard attempted several times to redirect the discussion toward areas where Brad could contribute, but Marcus consistently steered the conversation back to the contract details and technical specifications that were my domain. As we approached the lunch break, Richard made his final desperate move. Before we adjourn, I would like to propose a private executive session this afternoon, he said. Just senior leadership from both sides to discuss some sensitive financial adjustments I am authorized to offer. It was a transparent attempt to exclude me from a critical meeting. I remained silent, waiting to see how Marcus would respond. I assume Kim would be part of this session, Marcus asked pointedly. I was thinking more along the lines of just VP level and above, Richard replied. Some of these financial matters are quite sensitive. Marcus frowned. Mr. Parker, all financial terms are governed by the MSA that Kim drafted and that we have been discussing. Section 12.4 explicitly requires her presence at all material meetings. Unless you are suggesting these financial discussions are immaterial. Richard backpedaled quickly. Of course not. I merely thought a smaller group might speak more freely. In my experience, Marcus said transparency leads to better outcomes than secrecy. Kim will join us along with William and your team members who have relevant expertise. Richard had no choice but to concede. Of course, he said, his smile now visibly strained. During the lunch break, Richard disappeared, presumably to make more phone calls. The afternoon session began, with his seat conspicuously empty for nearly 10 minutes, before he finally returned, his expression carefully neutral. The executive session that followed was a masterclass in professional negotiation. When questions arose about specific contract terms, I provided clear, accurate information that protected both companies' interests. When William raised concerns about the data migration timeline, I suggested a phased approach that reduced risk without extending the overall schedule. The pivotal moment came when Marcus raised a question about the performance guarantee clauses. If the system does not meet the specified response times, what exactly are our remedies? Brad began to answer with generic reassurances, but I gently intervened. Section 10.7 provides for liquidated damages of $5,000 per day until performance standards are met, capped at 5% of the total contract value, I said. However, there is also a less discussed provision in 10.8 that allows for resource augmentation at Innovatech's expense if critical milestones are missed. Marcus looked impressed. That second provision is exactly what I was concerned about. Thank you for highlighting it. Richard attempted to take credit. These are the kinds of protections I insisted our legal team include, he said. William Chen looked skeptical. Actually, I specifically remember discussing that clause with Kim during our third contract review session. You were not on that call, Mr. Parker. Richard fell silent as Marcus continued addressing questions directly to me. By the end of the session, the implementation plan was approved with only minor adjustments to the timeline and resource allocation. As the meeting concluded, Marcus stood to address the room. Thank you all for your contributions to what I believe will be a transformative partnership. I want to especially acknowledge Kim's exceptional command of both the contractual details and the practical implementation concerns. Her insistence on being here despite obstacles demonstrates exactly the kind of commitment we value in a partner. The pointed reference to obstacles was not lost on anyone in the room. Several Sunshine executives nodded in agreement while my Innovatech colleagues tried to hide their reactions. Richard maintained his professional facade, but his knuckles were white where he gripped his pen. As people began to disperse, Marcus pulled me aside. I received a call from your CEO this morning, he said quietly. Apparently there was some confusion about your role here. My heart sank. Had Richard succeeded in turning our CEO against me? Your CEO assured me that Innovatech stands firmly behind the commitments made in our agreement, Marcus continued. He also mentioned that he would be reviewing internal communication practices to prevent future misunderstandings. Relief washed over me. Thank you for bringing this to my attention. No need to thank me, Marcus replied. Good partners look out for each other's interests. I look forward to working closely with you through the implementation phase. As Marcus walked away, Samantha approached with David and several other team members. That was incredible, she said. The way you handled everything without once making it personal or unprofessional. David nodded. Several of the Sunshine people told me they have never seen a vendor representative with such a comprehensive understanding of both the contract and the technical requirements. Their support meant a great deal, but I noticed Richard watching us from across the room, his expression unreadable. This victory, while satisfying, came with consequences that would likely follow me back to Seattle. As if reading my thoughts, Samantha leaned closer. The CEO's assistant called me during lunch, she whispered. There is going to be a full review of this situation when we return. Documentation has been requested. Thankfully, I have plenty of that, I replied. The final event of the trip was a celebratory dinner on the resort's beach. As sunset painted the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, I allowed myself to finally relax and appreciate where I was. The chess match was over, The client was satisfied. The contract was secure. Richard maintained his distance throughout the evening, engaging primarily with Sunshine's marketing executives rather than the technical and operations teams who had worked most closely with me. Brad, looking uncertain about his role, now hovered at the edges of conversations. Near the end of the evening, I approached Brad directly. "You did well jumping into a complex situation," I said genuinely. "That takes courage." He looked surprised by my kindness. "I had no idea about Section 12.4, he admitted. "Richard just told me it was a great opportunity to learn." "It still is," I assured him. "There will be plenty of work for both of us during implementation." As the evening wound down, I found myself standing alone at the edge of the beach, watching the moonlight on the waves. Richard approached his footsteps, nearly silent on the sand. "Enjoy your moment," he said without looking at me. "The real world will be waiting when we get back to Seattle." I turned to face him directly. "This is the real world, Richard, where actions have consequences, contracts matter, and doing the right thing for the client takes priority over internal politics." He finally met my eyes. "You have no idea how this game is really played. If the game requires abandoning professional ethics and contractual obligations, then perhaps it is time for new rules," I replied. Richard walked away without responding, his rigid posture conveying more than words could. I remained on the beach a while longer, reflecting on the events of the past few days. I had stood my ground, fulfilled my professional obligations, and protected both my company's and our clients' interests. Whatever challenges awaited me back in Seattle, I would face them with the same integrity and determination. The Hawaiian moon cast a brilliant path across the water, reminding me that sometimes the most difficult journeys lead to the most beautiful destinations. The return to Seattle brought gray skies and chilly temperatures, a stark contrast to the Hawaiian paradise we had left behind. I spent the 6-hour flight reviewing notes and preparing for whatever might await me at the office. Richard and Brad had taken an earlier flight, presumably so Richard could begin shaping the narrative before I returned. I was not worried. The truth had a way of emerging, especially when documented thoroughly. When I arrived at the office the following morning, an email was waiting from our CEO's assistant, requesting my presence in a meeting at 11 a.m. No agenda was provided, but the attendee list included our CEO, the Chief Legal Officer, HR Director, and Richard. Samantha caught me at the coffee machine. "Word around the office is that Richard has been on a campaign since returning yesterday," she whispered. "He is painting you as insubordinate and claiming you undermined his authority with the client." "Let him try," I replied calmly. "The documentation tells a different story." The 11th floor conference room, typically reserved for board meetings and major client presentations, felt unusually tense when I arrived precisely at 11. Richard was already seated reviewing papers with an air of forced nonchalance. Our CEO, Michael Stevens, a typically warm but no-nonsense leader, maintained a neutral expression as I took my seat. "Thank you all for coming," Michael began once everyone was settled. "I have called this meeting to address what happened during the Sunshine Resorts trip and to ensure we have clarity moving forward." Richard immediately leaned forward. "If I may, Michael, I would like to express my concerns about how chain of command was disregarded, potentially jeopardizing our relationship with a valuable client." Michael held up his hand. "I appreciate your eagerness, Richard, but I would like to establish the facts first." He turned to me. "Kim, I understand there was a disagreement regarding your participation in the client meetings. Could you explain your understanding of the situation?" I presented the events factually, starting with the airport incident and continuing through to the successful conclusion of the Hawaii meetings. I referenced specific sections of the MSA, the documented client request for my presence, and the ultimate positive outcome for Innovatech. Throughout my explanation, I remained professional, focusing on contractual obligations and client satisfaction rather than personal grievances. I concluded by presenting copies of all relevant documentation, including emails, the signed MSA with Section 12.4, highlighted, and notes from my conversations with Marcus. When I finished, Richard immediately countered with his version of events, characterizing my actions as an end run around established authority and creating confusion with the client about who was leading the engagement. Our chief legal officer, Patricia Wong, who had remained silent until now, finally spoke. Richard, I have reviewed the MSA thoroughly. Section 12.4 explicitly requires Kim's presence at all material meetings with Sunshine Resorts. This was not an optional provision. Contract language is always subject to interpretation and practical business considerations, Richard argued. Not in this case, Patricia replied firmly. The language is unambiguous, and according to our records, you were copied on all drafts containing this provision. Did you raise any objections during the contract development process? Richard shifted uncomfortably. I may not have focused on that particular detail given the overall complexity of the agreement. Yet you made a unilateral decision to violate that provision without consulting legal or getting client approval, Patricia noted. Michael turned to our HR director. Janet, from a personnel policy perspective, did Kim violate any company protocols by contacting the client directly after being removed from the trip? Janet reviewed her notes. No. Our policies encourage employees to fulfill contractual obligations and to escalate concerns when they believe company commitments are at risk. Kim followed the appropriate escalation path given the time sensitivity involved. Richard's expression darkened. So employees can now go around their supervisors whenever they disagree with a decision. Michael shook his head. That is not what happened here, Richard. This was a specific situation involving a contractual obligation that you attempted to circumvent without proper authority. The meeting continued for nearly 2 hours, with Richard attempting various arguments to justify his actions. Each time his position was undermined by the documentation I had provided and the clear language of our policies and the client agreement. Finally, Michael rendered his decision. Based on all available information, I have concluded that Kim acted appropriately to fulfill our contractual obligations to an important client. Richard, your decision to remove her from the trip without addressing the MSA requirements was an error in judgment that could have had serious repercussions for Innovatic. Richard started to protest, but Michael continued. Moving forward, Richard, you will no longer have direct involvement with the Sunshine Resorts account. Kim will serve as the primary point of contact, reporting directly to me for this engagement. It was a significant realignment of authority, effectively removing Richard from a major client relationship. His face flushed with barely contained anger. Additionally, Michael added, I am implementing a new review process for all MSAs to ensure that key personnel requirements are flagged and respected across the organization. Kim, given your attention to detail in this area, I would like you to lead that initiative. I would be happy to, I replied, maintaining a professional demeanor despite the vindication I felt. As the meeting concluded, Richard left without speaking to anyone. The others offered quiet congratulations as they departed, leaving me alone with Michael. That could not have been easy, he said once we were alone. Standing up to a VP, flying to Hawaii, knowing there would be conflict, maintaining your professionalism throughout. I believed it was the right thing to do for the client and for Innovatech, I replied simply. Michael nodded. That kind of integrity is rare and valuable. I have been considering creating a new position focused on contract governance across our major accounts. After seeing how you handled the situation, I believe you would be perfect for the role. The following weeks brought significant changes. Richard requested a transfer to our East Coast operations, effectively removing himself from the Seattle office where his authority had been so publicly diminished. Brad approached me to apologize for his role in the situation, and I took him under my wing, mentoring him on contract details and client relationships. Samantha and David became closer allies, part of a growing team that appreciated the value of thorough contract work and client commitment. The new position Michael had mentioned materialized as Director of Contract Governance, a promotion that included a substantial raise and a seat at the leadership table for major client decisions. The implementation with Sunshine Resorts progressed smoothly. Marcus frequently commented on how refreshing it was to work with a vendor who took their contractual commitments seriously. When minor issues inevitably arose, the foundation of trust we had established allowed for collaborative problem-solving rather than finger-pointing. 6 months after the Hawaii incident, I found myself back at the Sunshine Grand Honolulu, this time leading a team of my own for the successful launch of their new reservation system. Standing on the same beach where I had confronted Richard, I reflected on how a moment of professional crisis had transformed into an opportunity for growth. The experience had taught me invaluable lessons. Document everything. Know your contracts inside and out. Build relationships based on trust and competence. Stand firm when you know you are right, even when facing intimidation from those with more formal authority. Most importantly, I learned that true professional power comes not from titles or organizational hierarchy, but from expertise, integrity, and the courage to stand by your principles even when doing so is difficult. As I watched the Hawaiian sunset, so similar to the one I had seen 6 months earlier, yet viewed through entirely different eyes, I realized that sometimes you have to fight for your seat at the table. When you do so with professionalism, preparation, and principle, you not only secure your place, but elevate everyone around you in the process. Have you ever had to stand up for yourself professionally when someone tried to push you aside, or have you witnessed someone using fine print to their advantage in a situation that seemed unfair? I would love to hear your stories in the comments below. And if this story of standing firm against workplace politics resonated with you, please like, subscribe, and share with others who might be facing similar challenges. Remember, your professional value is not determined by those who try to diminish you, but by your knowledge, integrity, and willingness to stand your ground. Thank you for joining me today, and I wish you the courage to protect your seat at the table, whatever form that might take in your life.